Airtable agrees to $1.3 billion sale in AI SaaS shakeup. The exit highlights the speed at which AI agents can shrink active user bases in collaborative tools. The $1.3 billion price tag masks how few seats this leaves for pure workflow tools once agents start replacing them. Rivals like Monday.com now face pressure to either bundle AI agents or watch their own multiples compress by half. Expect at least 2 more mid-tier SaaS names to announce strategic reviews before year-end as buyers recalibrate what still justifies a premium. Feedback startup raises $125 million, valuation triples. The valuation jump signals more than product traction. Because the lead came from an Anthropic backer, the real asset may be the anonymized customer datasets now available for training loops. Other feedback platforms must decide whether to sell their own logs or risk losing ground in model partnerships that increasingly reward data access over feature depth. The pattern will repeat across vertical SaaS as model labs hunt for compliant training sources ahead of their next scaling push. NVIDIA's $800 million Reflection AI bet hits delays. The cash came expecting a quick open-source contender, yet the absence of any release lets Chinese labs set the pace on public weights. Reflection now risks becoming a footnote unless it pivots to proprietary enterprise fine-tunes. Watch how this affects NVIDIA's own software margins once partners question the ecosystem's momentum on open models. Any delay here pushes NVIDIA closer to acquiring smaller teams just to maintain narrative control in the open-source space by early next year. OpenAI's Astra excels at persistent multi-agent tasks. Persistent workflows change the cost structure because each successful run now consumes variable tokens until completion. Enterprise teams that pilot Astra will see their inference bills spike unless OpenAI caps retries in the SLA or offers usage credits for failed attempts. That forces Anthropic and Google to either match the capability or lose deals where reliability matters more than raw benchmark scores. Pricing pressure will hit first on the agentic tiers where retry logic determines the real per-task cost. Anthropic eyes strict rules for employee stock sales. Rank and file holders lose the ability to time exits around news cycles. The bigger effect is that top engineers may accelerate departure talks before any lockup binds them to the company through the IPO. Competitors recruiting from Anthropic now have a narrower window to close offers before the IPO calendar hardens. Talent pipelines at OpenAI and Google will see a short surge in inbound interest from those trying to exit ahead of restrictions next quarter. Firms build internal coding agents to cut costs. Custom agents at firms like Coinbase already cut token spend by half in internal tests. That shift hits revenue projections at the frontier labs hardest. Anthropic now faces a direct choice: drop per-token rates to retain volume or lock into longer enterprise contracts that exclude smaller teams. Either path narrows its mid-market wedge within the next year. Developers gain tighter control over data flows that public endpoints never allowed, reducing reliance on third-party oversight and slowing feedback to model trainers. U.S. states repealed data center tax breaks. States expect to collect an extra $1.5 billion yearly from facilities that lose their exemptions. Those added costs get passed through to new compute contracts signed after the repeal takes effect. Training runs already in planning will see per-gigawatt expenses jump enough to delay at least 2 major clusters by a full year. Cloud margins on AI workloads compress first. Startups without reserved power deals face the steepest increases and may delay product launches by up to 18 months. DeepMind ties $200 billion capex to recursive self-improvement. The justification hinges on whether recursive loops actually deliver measurable gains by late 2026. Absent clear jumps in capability per additional dollar, Google faces board pressure to trim its share of the annual spend. Rivals without the same infrastructure bets gain breathing room to license rather than build. Enterprise customers start demanding ROI clauses tied to those self-improvement milestones before renewing large cloud commitments. Palantir, positioned as NVIDIA of AI software, the comparison overlooks how software margins behave once models commoditize. Palantir's growth rests on locking customers into ontology work that competitors can replicate with open tooling inside 2 years. NVIDIA's edge came from hardware scarcity. Here, the moat is implementation services that shrink as in-house teams mature. Watch contract renewal rates slip once clients finish their first custom deployments. White House meets OpenAI, Anthropic, Google on AI rules. The meeting sets definitions that will shape export controls within 9 months. OpenAI and Google must now decide whether to accept narrow frontier thresholds or push for broader language that covers more competitors. Anthropic gains an opening to advocate for safety tiers that favor its current model size. Smaller developers outside the room lose clarity on future compliance costs and may freeze hiring plans. Apple sues OpenAI over trade secrets amid policy issues. Personal iCloud accounts turned Apple's devices into the unintended leak vector. OpenAI now faces audits that will stretch its legal budget through the next 2 quarters. This forces the company to either match stricter device policies across all staff or pivot to enterprise-only deployments that avoid consumer accounts altogether. The policy mismatch gives plaintiffs a clear path to show negligence rather than isolated theft. Mid-market customers will demand on-premise alternatives that sidestep the risk by the end of next year. Anthropic signs $10 billion deal with Volta cloud startup. Volta gains leverage to dictate terms on future inference runs. The real story sits in the data licensing clause that lets Volta train on Anthropic outputs. This forces every other frontier lab to renegotiate their cloud contracts within 12 months or watch their own model improvements get used against them. Enterprise SLAs will tighten as a result, pushing API margins lower across the board. Smaller players face even steeper hikes once the precedent spreads. Global memory shortage hits MacBook Air shipments. Buyers who waited for the next Air refresh now face 6-month backorders instead. Apple will likely shift more production capacity toward the Pro line where margins hold up better. This accelerates the existing trend of customers trading up, leaving the Air segment exposed to cheaper Windows alternatives by the second half of next year. Component lead times show no sign of easing before then. Watch inventory levels at retail partners drop faster than expected once education orders hit. China's AI giants shift focus to enterprise bundling. Bundling gives these companies a direct line into corporate data flows that consumer apps never provided. Domestic usage data now improves model performance faster than any public dataset could. This forces foreign providers to either localize their enterprise offerings inside China or watch mid-market share erode quarter after quarter. Local competitors gain the edge on compliance certifications that global teams still treat as an afterthought. The gap widens once procurement teams standardize on the bundled tools. The underquote Taiwan posts 11% growth on AI chip exports to US. The export shift pulls engineering talent and capex toward Arizona fabs faster than planned. TSMC must now prioritize US capacity expansions that were originally scheduled for 2026. This accelerates the timeline, leaving Chinese foundries further behind on advanced nodes by mid-2025 than most forecasts predicted. Supply agreements with US chip designers will lock in earlier slots, reducing flexibility for other regions. The growth number masks how quickly the supply chain is splitting along geopolitical lines. Qwen 3.8 Malabsient and Numpreni Didi Maxo on agentic tasks. Raw benchmark wins on agentic computer use rarely translate when models hit actual enterprise workflows with strict latency rules. Qwen's edge here suggests the next 6 months will see OpenAI either cut its agent tooling prices or lose ground in developer experiments. The real test comes when companies measure total cost per completed task rather than isolated success rates. Competitors like Anthropic must decide whether to publish their own agent numbers or risk looking slower by comparison. AI coding agents drive up budgets at startups. Monitoring dashboards are already clipping agent runs at teams that once let them spin freely overnight. The hidden effect surfaces in hiring plans, where startups now budget for AI oversight roles instead of extra engineers. This shift also changes how founders evaluate new tools, prioritizing predictable costs over raw capability gains. Replit's approach may spread, forcing Cursor and similar tools to embed spend limits or lose the smaller customers who cannot afford surprises on monthly bills. GLM 5.2 nears frontier but lacks safety mitigations. Frontier-level open models without guardrails shift the safety burden onto downstream users who often lack the resources to add them. The absence of built-in refusals also means academic labs can fine-tune around restrictions faster than expected. Regulators in Europe are likely to respond with mandatory audits for any model distributed this way within the next 12 months. AI's release gives closed competitors like OpenAI fresh ammunition to argue for tighter export controls on training methods. Snap discusses specs pre-orders in Q2 earnings. Pre-order figures matter less than whether Snap can scale manufacturing without the delays that plagued earlier hardware attempts. The earnings discussion signals that supply chain commitments are already locked in for the next cycle. Analysts will watch whether those pre-orders convert at rates that justify further investment rounds for component suppliers. Meta now has to decide if it will match Snap's retail partnerships or keep its AR efforts inside its own ecosystem where margins stay higher. AWS partners with vibe coding startup Superblocks. Enterprise buyers now gain a sanctioned path to experiment with AI coding tools without spinning up separate vendor relationships. The move pressures Microsoft to accelerate similar partnerships through Azure or risk seeding the mid-market segment where developers prefer flexible deployment options. Internal teams at both cloud providers will now track migration metrics more closely as budget decisions for developer tools consolidate around fewer platforms. Watch the next quarter's usage reports to see whether Superblocks pulls workloads away from GitHub Copilot.